So we're going to play a video that has to do with Todes, as in everyone with an E in Spanish, and it's on the topic of Argentina and the people's name on their identity card. In Argentina, we have a gender identity law. Since 2012, that sets the right to live freely according to our identity and to be respected and treated with dignity. It allows us to have access to medical treatments, hormonal, surgical treatments, and it also allows us to change our names, image, and gender marker on our ID cards so that they match our identity. The law was the first law not to pathologize the trans experience. It does not require a psychological, psychiatric, or medical certification. It just requires a person to declare on their own identity. It is understood as the internal individual experience of each person as they feel it. This definition is aligned with what the Jakarta Principles established, and it also respects gender identities. This is protected by several human rights approaches, among them the Human Rights Commission, the Human Rights Declaration that it has a constitutional level in Argentina. But as you may know, as in many other countries in the world, the laws are not respected and not always respected. Many times human rights are implemented partially, but not fully. Our rights are still being disregarded by public, private institutions, locally, in different municipalities, internationally, nationwide, etc. So from the organization Todes con DNI, or everyone with an ID card, we're working in this regard. We would like everyone who is non-binary, trans, or another option does not feel identified with our binary system, is not affected by it. We fight for respecting gender identity, so we call for the states that have the power to do this. We have the patriarchal system that does not belong to one political party. We understand that all states, regardless of who is leading the country, they are responsible for working together to eradicate the violence that we suffer every day. Our organization deals specifically with topics that have to do with records, so how we are registered and recognized by different institutions. First of all, through provinces and through birth certificates, also by the state, through ID cards, and also how we are registered with many other institutions that we need to work with daily: schools, hospitals, universities, banks. There are many places where name and sex or gender are recorded. And actually, in general, this is based on what the ID card says. But our law has a section that specifically says that we have the right to be registered according to our gender identity, even if we hadn't changed our ID cards. Additionally, the Argentinian law is very broad regarding its definition of gender. It doesn't talk about men or women or male, female, or things like that. It talks about internal evidence, internal experience. But 9 years after the implementation, the passing of the law, it's still applied, it's still implemented partially. The birth certificates issued by local governments are issued only if they say male or female. So we have the right since 2012 to change to amend our birth certificates. But if you had a certificate that said female, you could set it to male, and the other way around. We couldn't reflect other identities or leave that box empty. This changed in 2018 because some provinces started to issue birth certificates that did include different data. It's not all the provinces because it depends on each one. Different governments are autonomous. But this started to happen in several places because these new birth certificates were being issued. It was quite confusing because the people who were able to amend the birth certificates when they needed a new identity card, the national government rejected the change because the ID card is issued by just one authority, and that authority does not respect or did not respect these new options included in the birth certificates, so they wouldn't issue ID cards. Therefore, these people were left without an identity card. And after this situation, the Todes with the DNI was created. Of course, there is a Inter-American Human Rights Commission, and we are making a call so that all institutions treat us with dignity according to our identities. Also to the provincial and national governments, we want to ask them to issue ID cards that correspond to our identities, unless of applying imposed identities. Because we have created our identities through a lot of community effort. It is very difficult to live with the institutionalized violence we need to go through in the state. We thought it was very important to have a collective body that would help us. We started to help people who began these procedures to change their ID cards or certificates, and also other people who have amended the male-female box, but their rights are still being and are still under attack because their ID card, okay, has been amended, but in many other institutions, they have the old data, maybe a dead name or a sex or gender they don't use anymore. I'm saying sex and gender because we're always talking about gender identity, and we understand that gender identity is the official marker. But here on our ID card, the official marker is still called sex. We also support people who would not like to change, for now at least, their ID cards, but they would like this section to be fulfilled. Section 12 says that their identity should be respected, even if the ID card states something different. We provide administrative and legal support because the state should provide this information freely, but it doesn't. Most people have no idea what the process is like, and they don't know the consequences either. So we begin to talk about the needs and wishes of everyone who comes to us, so that they know what their decisions, how their decisions could affect them. And with them, we think about the different strategies that might be useful for their specific cases. So this availability, this emotional support, be it online or in person, are essential in the territorial work we do. From this experience that we have conducted, we have tried to talk to the state regarding the needs and problems of our collective. However, we haven't really been allowed to talk about this. And a few weeks ago, a decree was announced in Argentina that, unfortunately, although it aims to improve the situation and to recognize identities other than male or female, actually it doesn't solve the attack on our human rights, and specifically our right to identity. The decree reads that there is a new, like a third sex would be added through the X symbol. So from now on, we can include M, F, or X. This third category encompasses all the people that do not feel identified with either M or F. And although they aim to broaden rights, there are so many people that are still left behind, left outside. We're not all X. We have multiple identities, and we build ourselves from different paths, intersectionalities with different experiences as well. The law is very clear regarding gender definition. So once again, we insist that if we have an ID card that just mentions sex, is not enough. There should be one more field saying something like where we can include our own gender identity. In this way, they will really be inclusive. We need public policies, relevant public policies to be addressed together with our organizations, because we really know the consequences of these programs, so that we can achieve actions that have a specific and real impact on improving the living conditions of our community members. ID card in Argentina is something very important. Maybe it's surprising for some because they're not used in some countries. Some countries don't even have an ID card. Sometimes they only use a passport, but here in Argentina, it really impacts our daily lives because we need it to go to a hospital, to enroll at school, to have a vaccine shot, to pay with credit card, etc. We use them every day. So when we are forced to accept a gender mark that does not represent us in order to change our names, and when they force us to present ourselves in several environments with a gender that is not our gender, that is institutional violence. And it limits our access to basic rights like education, health, and work. We need ID cards that guarantee a decent life in our territories, to do things that are even more basic than traveling, things that are, because there are many more things that are important. They say that they want to include an X because it is accepted by some states as a travel document, but most non-binary trans or transvestite people do not have the financial resources to travel. So we are demanding that the state recognizes our gender identities, regardless of the complications it might entail for traveling to other countries. These complications could be solved, for instance, if someone has an ID card that is on a travel document, they could be issued a passport for free. And there in the passport, we could include an X because we don't use the passport every day for our daily lives and to access basic rights. So we know the limitations to gender identity in international law, of course, but we also know that human rights are above those administrative matters. We even know that international human rights treaties say specifically that there is no rule, that no rule can be an excuse to attack a right. So we call on the Argentinian government that was so progressive with the gender identity law and other issues. We hope this state is progressive once again by implementing the gender identity law and by actually defending it in the international arena by changing the agreements that are necessary so that all of our identities are respected. No state can accept the limitations of an aeronautical institution. We trust that our struggle and that the struggle of the Argentinian state internationally can reopen the debate so that laws can be modified and so that individual identities can be respected in all the countries where they are still not respected, where still the trans experience is pathologized.
And where letters from doctors or psychiatrists are still mandatory. We hope the fight of the Argentinian government at international level will help all of us in using our identities in the way that we choose to do so, with everything that means. We hope to work together with trans activists and non-binary activists from other places where we can build on our experiences based on the realities of each region, agreements that won't violate our rights and move freely without having to declare we are people, different people from who we really are. It is important to say that international regulations for traveling have to comply with international human rights standards. That means states cannot use those um, traveling international standards to limit our access to rights. And there's a two-way interpretation for this. First, we should understand that if a person has a marker different from M or F in their traveling documents, states cannot argue that that marker is not recognized by every other state and therefore protect the rights to the of that person in human mobility. It is still a citizen of that state. So they cannot just say, well, I provide this information, you can see what you can do with it. Also, this means that if states acknowledge there is a documentation, there is domestic documentation where you are identifying a person and you have to use those documents every day, the state cannot use as an excuse international traveling regulations and the partial acceptance of the category X as a gender marker to impose this in the domestic documents that are going to be used every day in every country, restricting access to the right to identity of many people who do not feel identify with an F, an M, or an X marker. All of this within the framework of human mobility. We know there are also many issues overlapping human rights that many migrants and refugees and asylum seekers have to deal with when having to go from one place to another across borders. So this is a framework that must be acknowledged as an area where human rights standards should still be applied and states cannot be using such technical or administrative excuses to limit our right to move freely in decent conditions. We would also like to say, well, as we said before, there are different laws in Argentina with regards to the access to rights of trans non-binary people, and one of those laws is the labor quota law. This law has different provisions that refer to the right to employment in the public sector, and it tries to encourage access in other sectors like the private sector or cooperatives, granting access to credit as well for trans or non-binary people who would like to develop their own endeavors. This direct relationship in this law to different rights. We know that the financial situation and the means of many trans and non-binary people access to employment is many times denied, and it could be the gateway to other rights as well, especially the right to healthcare, because In Argentina, healthcare, the gender identity law enshrines the right to access to health, even if you do not have employment at the moment, and you can make contributions to the national healthcare system. But the truth is that in many areas within the national healthcare system, the public system, there isn't true access to gender reassignment procedures that are associated to the bodily integrity of trans and non-binary people. So by enabling access to formal employment, we will be able to people will be able to access medical coverage or a social healthcare provider in public health, and therefore increase their access to health in a comprehensive manner, which they wouldn't have access to unless they have formal employment. So the labor quota law means progress in this regard for trans and non-binary people. It is also important to draw attention to what we've said before. It's one thing to have a law, and it's a different thing whether that law is imposed, it's enforced or implemented. So the civil society will still work towards the enforcement of the gender identity law and the regulation of rights for transvestite and non-binary people.
Great. Thank you so much. Sorry, Anthony.
Well, you have the floor. Thank you. Thank you, first of all, for your invitation, for inviting us to share our experience. In this clip, we tried to explain our own experience. I hope we were clear in our contribution. I think it is very important to highlight, and based on what Sa was saying earlier in the last minutes of the clip, with regards to the enforcement and the implementation of the laws that are trying to remedy some of the historic debt there's been to our community. We know that what happens in practice is those who are supposed to enjoy these rights are the ones that end up fighting for these quote unquote acquired rights. And this is serious. It is a big problem because, on the one hand, the state is the one who must ensure compliance of the law and protect our rights. And if it is the civil society, the ones that have to protect the rights, there's really no warranties for the full enjoyment of our life. Because even though there is a law in place, having to face so much red tape, so much bureaucracy and institutional violence because the law is not being complied with or it's not being enforced in the healthcare sector, in civil registry offices, education centers, it really means that you end up, it is a big constraint and a great limit to access our rights. The right to our identity is the gateway to access the different rights. It's not just about recognizing our national identity card at the registry office, but all our other endeavors across the institution. So article number 2 in the gender identity law, it's really a progressive article, but lack of enforcement or lack of implementation means that we are never getting closer to the institutions that we need to reach out to for a decent life, which is set forth under this law. And of course, the clip is not enough to really illustrate all of our experiences, but we cannot discuss the law or the name or the pronoun for 25 minutes, and it is so hard to convey all of the problems and difficulties that we have to experience in reality. So for the rest of the population, going to the registry office might take just 5 minutes to get your new identity card. And it really takes hours for us to go and fight for it. And sometimes you just don't feel like doing it. You just, as Nat said in the video, we created the tool to fight against institutional violence because it excludes our possibility even to access information. That's why we want to promote, as we have said before, through our social media, through our work, through our support, we promote access to information. It is very hard to protect our rights individually when we have to face bureaucracy or red tape if we are not even aware of the laws. So how can we build? How do we regulate? How should laws be enforced? And many times, even people knowing that these laws exist, they are not even respected. So just to wrap up, I think it is important to share our experience with all of you, to try to really find shared ground with other people in other places, because access to a decent life, access to our identities it shouldn't have national borders. It should not be constrained to national borders. So being able to go more in depth and really rich discussions and really be able to share with all of you, since we all have such great privilege on having access to information and knowledge. It is good that we share the community strategies being adopted to ensure the enforcement of these laws that are so essential for all of us.
Thank you so much for that. That was such an amazing presentation, and I hope I'm sure we'll have a really great discussion about that in the last 15 minutes. And we're getting some comments in the chat about how you can tag Todos con DNI. Raine, that brings us to your presentation, which is also going to be incredible.
Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I'm Raine Cortes. I'm from the Asia Pacific Transgender Network. We are based in Bangkok, Thailand. It's actually around 2 a.m. in here, but I'm still wide awake because it's an opportunity to be part of this groundbreaking TPATH conference. I will start actually with a video. I know that a lot of the participants in here are coming from the other side of the globe, and it would be good to have a little bit of context builder regarding the situation of trans people in Asia Pacific. So I'm gonna share a screen of a video for a while. Sorry. For a while. Okay. There.
I think almost all the sister trans women in Asia and the Pacific faces the same situation.
Trans men situation is very hard.
Well, being trans
guarantees that you're going to be upsetting someone.
I'll be walking down the road and someone will turn around and say, hey, AIDS, ADC in Tongan.
They always call me Banchi, Benchong. It's a word of Bahasa. It means CC.
I've been rejected from my family and my society.
They will only accept me if I only change or cut my hair or change the way I dress.
People, when they perceive and recognize you as a transgender, they will address you as Sir, Mr., and it's very offensive because it will embarrass you to people and sometimes humiliate you.
When I was young, going to school was a nightmare. I had to dress like a male uniform. I was bullied, I was hit, and I could not tell anyone, the teacher, the parents, because I was afraid to be judged or punished by them.
And I told my teacher that these guys tried to, take out my clothes. And the teacher said that you are behaving pansy. You are behaving in a feminine way. So it's not their fault. It's your fault.
You want to be a psychologist, but you're transgender, you're not allowed.
I would like to have been like the doctor in the hospital. I cannot. My friend want to be the teacher. Cannot. Most of transgender in Thailand, we can work or 2 or 3 work only. Makeup artist, cabaret show, and the last choice, sex worker.
The issue is that with our community, there is no option.
My issue is about not having an employment, not earning money with dignity.
So the discrimination within the healthcare setting is in lots of different layers.
Transition-related healthcare for trans men is essentially non-existent.
When you talk about being a transgender to go to government hospital, of course we are reluctant to go. I think it's because of the judgmental attitude of the staff of the hospital.
As long as you walk into that lab, someone who's your neighbor or someone who knows you will just turn around and say, I wonder what he's up to.
We're at risk for all the same sorts of gynecological problems that cis women are, but typically don't receive continuing care.
Many times that transgender women have to go to the private clinic, in which is very expensive.
Trans people are using hormone and all the things without any prescription, going to the pharmacy and taking the birth control pills as a hormone.
If you're really sick and you want to get warded, you'll be put in the female ward, which is a terrible thing because nobody wants to see my face in the female ward.
I would like to see that transgender can change title of the name.
I wish that the privacy can be kept for the transgender who don't want to disclose it, and respect to those who come out, just like respecting any other persons.
Transgender want to learn and want to educate themselves.
I think it's very important not to forget that we are humans and that we need the same kind of things as other people.
The commitment, the political commitment, has to come up from the respective country, and the country should start owning the transgender community as their own citizen with constitutional rights, human rights, and basic rights of human being as they are.
To train the doctor and sensitize them about the transgender issues.
For health providers to increase their knowledge in transgender issues.
If we have female appearance, then put us in female ward.
Healthcare services must be accessible and affordable for every single transgender.
I hope in the future that every transgender citizen is conscious to their well-being and exercise their right to health.
I believe that this is the beginning, and I am looking forward that we will have a very encouraging and supportive environment for transgender people.
My hope for the future of trans people is that we eventually get to be treated like people.
What we are advocating for is equal right, not special right.
Trans rights are human rights.
So thank you for watching that video. I'm sorry. Now they want to play all the videos. Just a moment. I'll just share my video, my PowerPoint presentation. Okay. So you have seen the video that was prepared by APTN, or the Asia Pacific Transgender Network, with support, of course, from UNAIDS regional Bangkok office in here. And every time I see that video, it is actually captured during the WPATH conference in 2014 here in Bangkok, Thailand. And it was an opportunity for trans and gender diverse people to come in from different parts of the world, especially coming from Asia Pacific, to convene and to make sure that their voices are heard amidst all the healthcare providers. So that video itself always makes me grounded and think that we are indeed transcending borders. And that's why what I'm going to present to you is what I call transcending borders, or mobilizing towards trans competent care in Asia and the Pacific. This is a lot of the work that APTN and its country partners have been doing for the past 10 years since APTN was founded. So I know that a lot of you was not fully familiar with what APTN does, but this is just a very brief thing that as a transgender-led organization and a network, we were initially founded in 2009, wherein majority were actually transgender women. But through the years, a transgender man and a trans masculine person came in to the organization and gave light and shed light that we also need to give focus and attention to issues of trans masculine folks. And that's still our vision right now, a society that upholds, respects, and protects the diversity and safety and equality of dignity of trans people. And this is really embodied with our strategic priorities regarding building robust and resilient trans movement, including making sure that they are giving spaces in national, regional, or international advocacy, but at the same time, the concept of organizational development and strengthening needs to be there. So those three strategic priorities is actually embedded with our three strategic pillars as well of building, advocating, and strengthening. And a lot of our work is not possible if we do not mobilize trans communities and trans individuals, which we consider not as beneficiaries, but actually our partners in the movement that we are doing here in Asia Pacific. So these three strategic pillars has been our foundation in the work that we have been doing for the past 10 years. And as you can see in the main key areas of the work that we do, we make sure that as a regional network, we're able to facilitate funding for country-based organizations and as well increase their trans representation and visibility. And of course, the advancement towards access to health is a very key core concept that we are actually able to push for, including advancing for fulfillment of human rights and generating strategic information or doing research. So all of this are encapsulated within our strategic pillars that we have been living for the past 10 years. And I know that when you hear Asia and the Pacific, you would think that it's one of the biggest, if not the biggest continent in the world. And currently, APTN only works in 4 subregions. Majority is in South Asia, Southeast Asia, the Pacific, and a little bit of East Asia. So the network doesn't work in majority of Central Asia as well as in the Middle East, because we don't have that certain expertise to delve into these other regions. And of course, the restrictions, the legal restrictions that there is in those regions is not something that we are very familiar with. So this is the scope basically of APTN's work. In line with developing strategic information, a lot of the publications that are seen in here has been developed to address the issue of lacking of trans-specific knowledge products. And one thing that I would like to highlight in here is the blueprint for the provision of comprehensive care. And this is a guidance document that is very relevant to the Asia Pacific. And it was challenging actually to develop a regional document given the diversity of the different countries that we are working with. And also being in line with getting support and approval and technical guidance coming from USAID or the WHO, but this blueprint has been the guiding document of many countries who started with their trans health program in Asia and the Pacific. So this document is something that still remains to be valid and being used by majority of our countries. This one about legal gender recognition was a multi-country legal and policy review that was done in 9 Asian countries, wherein we are also doing the 10th pilot in the Fiji, wherein it's a review of laws and policies that can be used for or against advocating for legal gender recognition in the country. In our region, there's not a lot of legal gender recognition laws. A lot is focusing on transgender protection bills, and most of it are in South Asia, and very limited in Southeast Asia, especially in the Pacific. This other product is about understanding stigma and transphobia, which we are very proud of because this is purely community-led. It's coming from data and community-based organizations coming from 4 countries. And this is one of our products that was done by and for transgender people. And the other one is about employment, discrimination in employment when you are applying. And this one is about a mapping of trans organizations where it highlights that it's even less than 10%, especially in our region, is receiving funding, especially in this case. And we have a regional mapping as well that contains snapshot information on the state of transgender health, rights, and development in the region. And of course, looking as well into issues of conversion therapy in 4 countries, wherein practices, harmful practices, even health interventions are being used against trans people in the context of the so-called conversion therapy. The products that you can see on the right side are all relevant to advocating for transgender health. These are more recent publications that we did that we think is very useful for countries to use as their respective information materials in the country. There is a guide for testosterone use for trans masculine folks, estrogen use or hormone use for trans feminine, a guidelines for healthcare providers, and as well as a guide for sexual and reproductive health. And the important thing in here is that as a growing organization, we developed these tools initially as in English, but knowing the diversity of languages, we have started translating a lot of this publications into local languages in respect as well with the diversity of the different languages that we are serving. Aside from those publications, we thought that in order to help communities mobilize and to think of something more sustainable to leave them, we also develop what we call toolkits as a guidance that can help communities to do their own advocacy or to even do their own mobilization or workshops. As you can see, this is something transcending toolkit that you can use to as a guide for doing your own workshops or facilitating a group of trans people when you are doing strategic planning or even areas of identifying emerging issues. The other one is about a Tidor guide for sensitive reporting. And the others, when we have reports or publications, we also do a social media campaign. And we made sure that there's a social media toolkit that is accessible online so that when partners are interested to use this information in their own advocacy work at the national level, they can make use of it, of this social media toolkit. So we make sure that they not only become research publications, but as well utilized by our community partners in their own advocacy. One report that I would highlight, and the most recent, if I would say, is in relation, especially, I know that everyone experienced COVID, but we responded to COVID in different ways in 2020. And we came up with our Trans Resilient report, which summarizes our interventions for the whole year of 2020, where we did provide relief support to around 22 community-based organizations, and they decided on their own on how they can provide support to their respective communities at this challenging time. And as a take back, they did report to us what is the situation, human rights situation, COVID situation impacting HIV, or for example, gender affirming care, which you can see in this small infographics that we shared in our social media, wherein COVID really impacted the access to gender affirming care. Gender affirming care is already not a prioritized health intervention, more so during the COVID time, wherein even the basic access of hormones not available in the country, and many countries here outsource from another country, and because of the restrictions, that made them not be able to access the appropriate gender-affirming hormones that they are supposed to take, which in turn, of course, resulted into greater anxiety, depression to them, which was narrated by our communities. So this report will not actually be possible if this data was not provided by our partners and our communities as well. One thing that we also would like to highlight is we also want to make a platform to showcase champions coming from the communities. So we did have a support from UNAIDS and AIDS Funds, and we partnered with another regional youth-led network here in Asia Pacific to highlight champions who are trans youth, and some are trans pill HIV, who are leading the response during COVID. And we did a social media campaign on that, and you can see them here, 8 of them, trans women, trans men, trans masculine, as well as gender queer advocates that were advocating on their own despite the pandemic. And this is something that we need to ensure when we mobilize, that we give them spaces to actually be spotlighted or highlighted, that they can do their own in their local and grassroots advocacy and mobilization. If not for COVID, we would, APTN usually convenes annual partnership meetings, or we do participate in regional or international conferences or platforms, but we made sure that APTN brings their country partners. So it's not only APTN who participates in these conferences. We want to make sure that our communities directly is given a platform and go to this conference, share the issues, advocate, and bring it back directly to their countries. And that's what we make sure in all these convenings that we have participated pre-COVID, of course. As you know, a lot of this work has been done virtually now, and that's what I'm going to present in the next few slides. Something very relevant to mobilizing communities for transgender health. I know that in 2018, you know, the historic World Health Assembly adapting the revisions to ICD-11, and APTN did partner with different regional and global organizations regarding depathologization. And as you know, there are ups and downs in the revisions itself. And in 2018, as you know, that the trans-related categories have been removed already from the chapter on mental health. They have been moved to sexual health, where it still poses some questions. Even the introduction of a new chapter regarding gender incongruence was also highly contested, but we see it as a transitory term, imperfect solution, that it means that communities, even though with the passing of the revisions of the ICD-11, that communities remain to have a role to actually determine a terminology that would really fully depathologize trans identities. And APTN in this global advocacy or joint advocacy also made sure that this information, very technical, if I may say, information, is brought down to communities. So we did conduct like 5 country workshops and how to engage communities and understand ICD, depathologization, and how they can advocate and lobby to their policymakers, as well as to healthcare providers to promote depathologization as well. And in relation to that as well, our spaces and our collaboration goes beyond our borders of Asia Pacific. As mentioned, we do partner with regional and global organizations such as GATE, ILGA World, RFSL, and TGEU, wherein since 2017, we have been conducting this UN Trans Advocacy Week in line with the UN Human Rights Council in June and July. And for the past 2 years, of course, it became virtual. But one of the highlights in this case is, of course, the joint advocacy towards the renewal of the UNIG SOGI, which has been very supportive of trans advocacy efforts and issues. So even issues of health are brought into an international platform such as the UN Human Rights Council. And even with COVID, we remain to conduct virtual Trans Advocacy Week, wherein we made sure that our country partners, trans leaders and advocates, go to these global spaces to advocate for themselves. So we just provide them a platform to engage in this global and international human rights mechanisms. More specifically, last year and this year, we did support through our human rights and advocacy team. We support 4 countries to develop joint CSO reports for the Universal Periodic Review. For example, Nepal, Papua New Guinea, Singapore, and Samoa. And what is interesting in here is that the technical guidance that were provided to them it's still the trans-led partner or the country partner who leads the development of this report. And luckily, one of the highlights in here is that from the Nepal recommendations, during the negotiation, there was actually 4 SOGSC specific recommendations that was adopted and put into consideration. And that is something that we are really aiming with its technical support, that it really translates into something that would be useful to the partners. Similarly, we do virtual workshops last year, especially to keep the fire of still advocating despite the pandemic. So there was a series of skills for building workshop, but at the same time, we did launch an Amplifying Trans Advocacy Fellowship program last year, wherein we had 26 trans and gender diverse fellows, wherein 16 of them was provided a succeeding small grant or seed grant to do an advocacy intervention after the fellowship program. And you see here 3 products of our fellows. One is from Malaysia, was an advocate of non-binary campaigns. One is focusing on India about understanding militarism. And the other one is about showcasing trans people in different work, especially in Samoa. So we made sure that there's a lot of varied diversity, and we don't necessarily inform them of what they need to do. These are all proposals of seed grants that are coming from our communities themselves. Going back to the focus regarding health and pushing for and lobbying for trans competent care, moving from our advocacy from ICD-11, APTN developed what we call a transgender healthcare and rights module. Earlier, you saw the trans health blueprint, but it's like a 100-page guidance document. And we were looking for something that is translatable to a training tool. And we developed this transgender health and rights module. It was led and written by a trans person. And a lot of our reviewers are trans healthcare providers and allies as well. So right now, we have a final version of this module, and you can see the different topics or modules that we're using. And we see this as an introductory resource guide for healthcare providers and peer providers so that they can use this to train more healthcare providers and peer providers in their respective countries. We do aim to translate these modules and pilot them through sensitization workshops in selected countries. And we are also translating them to about 10 local languages in Asia Pacific. One thing that I'm going to show you, another product that we developed, and I know
Sorry,
community-based.
I just want to come in
Yes,
for a
sorry.
second, Raine, and give you about a 5 or 6 minute warning.
Yes, yes. Thanks for that. I'm going to show you a video of the other tool that we developed, which is the TransComp, or Competency Community-Based Monitoring Tool. It's just about 2-minute video for a while. Sorry.
It's okay, take your time.
Here.
Transgender people have very specific healthcare needs that shouldn't be reduced to only HIV, sexual, and reproductive health services. In fact, a myriad of social and health-related issues affect their well-being and ability to live full and productive lives. Particularly in the Asia and Pacific region, these concerns are sometimes compounded.
What happened?
Is it just lagging?
Did it stop?
Yeah, it stopped.
Maybe it's trying to read. Sorry.
Oh, it's okay. We're doing good for time.
I don't know what happened.
If you want to put the link in the chat, I can play it on my screen.
Yes, for a while.
If you just send the link to the chat, I will share my screen and show it.
Here.
Oh, there it is. Right, 1 second. Okay, this is me sharing my screen. There we go.
Transgender people have very specific healthcare needs that shouldn't be reduced to only HIV, sexual, and reproductive.
Noah, I need you to turn the volume up because I cannot hear the
Oh,
video.
sure.
I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry to
Not at
interrupt.
all. I think I didn't share the sound, so let me just stop it and start it again.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I didn't share sound.
Okay.
We're all right.
Transgender people have very specific healthcare needs that shouldn't be reduced to only HIV, sexual, and reproductive health services. In fact, a myriad of social and health-related issues affect their well-being and ability to live full and productive lives. Particularly in the Asia and Pacific region, these concerns are sometimes compounded not only by the fact that trans people have less access to healthcare responding to their needs, but also due to limited employment opportunities, housing, lack of insurance coverage, substance use, or fear of stigma and discrimination from healthcare providers. The Asia Pacific Transgender Network, APTN, is helping to change that with the development of a TransComp, or competency, community-based monitoring tool. Community-based monitoring, or CBM, also referred to as community-led monitoring, can help trans community members and healthcare providers measure the availability, accessibility, acceptability, and quality, AAQ, of healthcare services provided to trans people. Here's how it works. The TransComp CBM tool consists of 3 parts. The TransComp CBM scorecard and Excel spreadsheet for trans community members, the TransComp provider checklist for service providers, and the TransComp provider action plan, also for service providers. While each component is separate and is designed for separate audiences, they work together to provide the tools needed for community members to monitor and for healthcare providers to improve their services. By using a classification system with rankings of bronze, silver, and gold, community-based and civil society organizations and service providers can provide insight into service gaps and establish a roadmap to achieving trans-competent services. These results can be used to advocate for better healthcare systems and services, and to hold government and healthcare providers accountable. For more information on the individual components of APTN's TransComp CBM tools, see the additional videos in this series.
Thanks, Noah. Just so quickly, I know it's like a minute. I just need a minute, and then I'll finish this last slide. So as you can see, that was the Transcom CBM tool. That is something that we recently developed. And we, as mentioned, it's a series of tools that communities can use the scorecard, but we made sure that there are complementary tools for the healthcare providers so that whatever feedback they receive from communities coming from the scorecard, they're able to use the provider checklist and the provider action plan to plan out and to address the issues that were raised in terms of their trans competency. So this goes to my last slide. We are still one component that we are really pushing forward is forging ahead on this trans-competent healthcare. And you've already seen the transgender healthcare rights module, and you have seen the Transcom CBM tools, but we are also aiming to do a healthcare service provider mapping in different Asia Pacific countries to see a list of trans-competent healthcare. And all of this are also going to be hosted in our Trans Health online learning hub, which eventually will partner with a training certified institution to provide this as a learning credits for healthcare providers. And as mentioned, we're also doing a sensitization workshop to selected healthcare providers and peer providers in the countries. And lastly, for trans community, we want to make sure that they have lobbying tools, standard messages when they advocate for pushing for gender affirming care, and of course, sexual reproductive health and rights and HIV as well. So in that regard, I know that there's a lot of information that was shared. You can always visit our website at weareaptn.com, and we can share you all these tools that we have shared in here. Thank you very much for the opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that amazing presentation and those videos. I know we don't have any questions in the Q&A, but I'm sure people are just bursting with questions. So I'd love to invite folks to comment in the chat or on the Q&A with their questions. We'll just give folks a few minutes or a few seconds to get those in. I wonder if while we're waiting for that, Raine, if you could, you touched on this a bit in your presentation, but I wonder if you could talk to the work that APTN is doing or is trying to do, reaching out to organizations in, say, Southeast Asia and Indonesia.
Specifically about what? Sorry.
I just wonder, like, what your representation is in Indonesia, for example.
Yeah, so earlier, as I mentioned, we are not a network membership-based organization. We do have partners in each of the countries. Specifically in Indonesia, we do have around 3 trans-led and trans-inclusive organizations that we partner with. So a lot of the interventions that I shared to you are usually in collaboration with Suara, Jaringan Transgender Indonesia, which is a recently transgender network, and even trans-inclusive organizations such as GWL-INA. So a lot of this work is usually done, and we provide sub-grants as well to these community-based organizations.
That's great to hear. Actually, that makes me wonder, is APTN, I know obviously you're very well represented in Thailand, but do you have any presence in South Thailand?
Not in particular. So a lot of our trans-led organizations, for example, Thai Transgender Alliance is in Bangkok. We have Sisters Foundation, which is based in Pattaya. Yeah, we don't have much partners based in South Thailand. We do have some in Northern Thailand, like Chiang Mai, but not really Southern Thailand.
That's great. And I wonder if both you and Todos Kunti and I could speak to the issue of censuses and if they have any kind of impact in your work or if that's something you're focusing around.
Maybe I'll ask Todes first.
Perdón, ¿puedo pedir que repitas la pregunta porque no llegué a comprenderla?
Could you repeat the question, please? I didn't fully understand it.
Sure. I was wondering if censuses are an area for in which you target activism. So are you interested in getting more questions around trans people's experiences or identifying trans people in national censuses?
Yo creo que con el tema de los censos también.
I think that the census are a problem, or one of the main issues is to who's developing and who's designing the census and what's the point of it, what's the objective, because they can also direct the information, or I don't really know what I'm trying to say. So statistics are built based on certain objectives. So having a record or acknowledgement outside the gender binary, the female, male, it is important, even beyond the census when it comes to public registry offices. Not long ago, maybe 15 days ago, we were only able to choose female or male in our identity cards. Now, with the new employment quota law, I'm wondering if my identity only shows female or male in the state registry, how do they define that 1% quota? I mean, what is the registry that they are keeping? What are the records that are being kept? Now, in the cases that we work with, we really push for proper registry or proper records at state level. We used to be told, well, you cannot request this for this and this and that, even though it goes against the law. Many people, without knowing what the law would allow them to do, they take the word of the public office clerk as the final word, and they only think that they can select male and female. So having a record means that it will build new statistics, even though there might not be a census, because what we are requesting is that my attempt or my paperwork will be recorded under a case file number. And so maybe in the past, people were told that and they would leave the office without even more effort, or they would even accept to choosing the F or the M for accessing that identity card, because that would mean a certain improvement to their life. But there is no record of how many people actually attempted for a new option or how many people actually requested a new option. So we have not addressed census, but a group of the trans and non-binary and transvestite group working for trans healthcare are addressing this issue, but Todes con DNI really considers that statistics are more about compliance and enforcement of the law from an administrative standpoint. It means that there should be record of our attempts to these achievements. Let me also add, we demand compliance to human rights standards in general. So when it comes to census, what we want is a census to be built with us, together with us. I mean, we are the target population for that data collection endeavor. when it comes to diversity in terms of gender or sexual orientation, or other categories, for example, ethnicity or racial categories. So the state or the institutions are required to build these tools together with the target population, because everything that has to do with data collection, it is very important to show indicators. Indicators allow us to monitor compliance with human rights regulations in a given place, in a given country. So that should be built together with community engagement.
Great. That's a
Can
very.
I
Oh,
ask
sorry.
a
Go ahead.
question? Can I? Okay. Very briefly, there was a question here in the chat section. Someone says that the word transvestite is being used many times, and they're asking whether it means the same as in the US, but in Latin America, this is a feminine identity, but it's not necessarily a trans woman. It used to be an insult in the past, but for many decades now, people identify themselves as transvestite, as their own identity. I am sorry, Francisco, to interrupt. I know that historically it's more about trans feminine, but recently it's been really discussed the fact that it's not a category that is only part of the trans feminine spectrum, but other people I myself recognize as transvestite, and it might not be within the trans feminine spectrum, but other trans male and non-binary also might identify as such. Historically, it could be found as part of the trans feminine spectrum, but it's now also migrating to others as well. Thank you for that. And the question, since Todes con DNI is here and APTN is here as well, as explained earlier, in Argentina, we now have the option to use the X marker in our identity documents. And I know that some countries in Asia have had this option for a while now. So I was wondering if, Raine, you could tell us what that experience has been like, what have been some of the positive outcomes of that X being an option, or maybe negative impacts on the community. If there have been any, there might not have been.
Sorry, thanks for that question. I just want to respond briefly to the question about census. So APTN doesn't delve into a lot of national level advocacy work. If it's an issue that is very relevant and an advocate from the country is strong for that, we try to provide technical support in the context of how to create more sensitive reporting or collection of data. We are more invested right now into, because we don't have a lot of change laws that is in line with changing gender markers. And when you go to a healthcare service provider, you are still tagged based on your sex assigned at birth. That is still or remains to be the first step in most countries in Asia Pacific that we push for on how do we basically collect sensitive reporting for transgender identities in the healthcare setting. And that's the first step that most advocates do. And currently, a lot of those SOGSC advocates in here doesn't use transvestite anymore in the Asia Pacific region. As you know, it's an older term referring to cross-dressers, and there's a plethora of different identities that are being used, even religious, indigenous, different identities around Asia Pacific. And that's the approach that we work in sensitization of SOGSC, rather than using, if possible, not to use Western terms of transgender. If we can use, for example, in the Pacific, Fa'atama, Fa'afafine, or Maknya, or Warya, or Transpinay, or Transpinoy in the Philippines, that would be a more appropriate learning for trans communities and enlightening them. I would still say in terms of the gender marker that in most of the South Asian countries, it's very different. Some have even a T option, for example, in India, for transgender, and Hijras as well. And in Sri Lanka, it's only limited to the binary. So you can change, but you're limited. So I would just say that in the end that it differs per country. I cannot really say that there's a collective regional accomplishment, but each country has its own step forward already. Thanks.
Thank you so much for that. And I think that really highlights the importance of not universalizing things like what are accepted and unaccepted language. I see that in the autism community as well. But this has been such a great discussion, and I really wish we could keep going, but I'm mindful of the interpreter's time as well. Thank you so much for joining us here. I'm going to be closing the room, and we will go into our final room for the 3 days. It's been so amazing to have you all here, and I'll see you in just a second.